Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to come to Skibbereen anyway. I don't do it often enough. Obviously, we're talking about Seamus Murphy, Mairead, and their society. There's an impulse to call it an era, except that when we were living through it, we didn't know that it was an era, or that it had any particular significance for anybody but ourselves. So this is a very general view. It's entirely my own. It's not directly related to Seamus and Mairead, except in one or two small instances. But it goes to the very beginning. Admittedly, I wasn't taking too much notice of anybody in the 1950s, but this does go back just to the times, beginning with the years when, as Louis Marcus has described it, a frightened conservatism descended on Ireland and lasted for decades. And that was the milieu, if you like. That was the convention into which Seamus brought his work, and Mairead brought her work as well, which was very significant. So my approach is to list briefly and possibly unfairly the names of those people whose presence, however intermittent through a span of 40 or 50 years, still come to my mind. And I have to insist on this small qualifier that these are my choices, strongly city-centred, city-based and interwoven into the political and artistic life of the city. Now that life was variously expressed, sometimes amid controversy, sometimes as a quiet determination to expand Cork's potential and possibilities, sometimes as a simple commitment to carry on doing the best that one can do in given circumstances until somehow those circumstances change, as they did, of course, and sometimes just because of the persistence of some of these people who were not content to accept life as they found it. And it was from these people survive such lasting institutions as the Cork Orchestral Society, the Cork Film Festival, the Crawford College of Art, the Cork School of Music, the Cork Operatic Society. Some were a direct result of their activity and some survived through their fidelity. Now, in general, not to make this like a gazette of personalities, but these were kind of people in the streets and the people in the lecture halls. And if anybody wants to get a good visual image of Cork during those years, they should go to the Seamus Murphy building in Blackpool, the Archive Centre, where the former Lord Mayor Anthony Barry presented an archive of his photographs of the city and its people during those years. It's absolutely fascinating. It's available online, and it really is worth looking up. So in general, the names that just filtered through for me were Jenny Dowdall, Douglas Vance in the Metropole Hotel, Noreen O'Sullivan of the Green Door, Charlie Hennessy, Sorla McCanna, James Stack, James W. O'Donovan, Derb Breen, Rachel Burrows, Cynthia Treston, C.J.F. McCarthy, Geraldine Neeson, Annie Crosby you care to mention, Der Donovan, Bridget Doolan, Barra O'Tuama. Then there were and are all the Seans: Sean Neeson, Sean O'Tuama, Sean O'Riada, Sean O'Riordan, Sean O'Whalon, Sean McRaymond, Sean Hendrick. Then there was the Palace Bar. I never got there, but it was there. Here could be met Dahi and Paddy Collins, Diarmuid Hurley, Nancy McCarthy, and again Sean Hendrick. At UCC, I'm not so sure, apart from Cormac O'Quillinon, Professor of Irish, and his wife Eilish Dillon, the cellist and writer of many fine books for children, along with some entertaining murder mysteries. She was fluent in Irish, and her English translation of Queen Artie Lara is still believed to be the best, and I say that on the authority, of course, from John A. Murphy, who wasn't a Sean, just a John. Closer to home on Wellesley Terrace, there was what might be called the casting couch in the living room. Mairead said once that when she went up to bed, she never knew whom she might find sleeping downstairs in the morning. I never saw anyone on it except the cat, Mould. But Louis Marcus rested there, Andreas O'Gallacure, and a variety of others who temporarily had no home to go to, or who, after one of the late night parties, couldn't quite remember where home might be. Then there was the terrace itself. Sheila McCurtain was next door giving lessons on the harp while also working at the record department in Eason's. The politician Maureen Quill and her sister Ida still live a few doors down, and the redoubtable Tilly Fleischmann, who was a concert pianist of great significance, taught piano at her home on the terrace. Then the powers that were. The two prominent examples that come to mind as somehow having been in contention all the time were giving a pervasive sense of obstacles which could sometimes harden into downright opposition, were the Archdeacon Canon James Bastable, PP of St. Patrick's Church on the Lower Road, and Paddy Parfrey, CEO of the Cork Vocational Education Committee. Now, you mightn't think that that was a position of any great power and influence, but actually it was, because Paddy Parfrey and the CEO together were really very, very prominent and very persuasive and very dominant people in the city for quite a number of years. There was also, of course, Cornelius Lucy, the Bishop of Cork and Ross, but he was more remote and stayed so until the imbroglio of Humanae Vitae and Father James Good broke over his head and that of the university, the clergy, and what seemed at the time like the entire population. Through and often above all this commonality of experience were what I regard, for the purpose of this talk, all the Olympians. It was Rachel Burrows who introduced us to the immediacy of W.B. Yeats, of his plays, and his phrase echoes in my mind when I give you these remaining personages, influencers and activists. We didn't know we were activists, we were... Basically, they were just doing their thing. In one way or several others would have been known to, important to, or significant in the lives of Seamus and Mairead, and in their legacies to all of us who remember them as I do today. There was, for example, William Dwyer of Sunbeam, who was a politician as well as a businessman, an entrepreneur before we knew that the word existed. And in his sustained patronage of Seamus Murphy, he found an outlet to his almost Renaissance-like appetite for the arts as an active enhancement to life. He also commissioned work from Murphy for his factories at Middleton, the Worsted Mills, and Youghal, Seafield Fabrics. A panel at the Blackwater Cotton Factory is also by Seamus, and in 1952 the people of Youghal commissioned a panel from Seamus for this factory to commemorate William Dwyer, who brought the first textile industry to this town in 1947. The collaboration of William Dwyer and Seamus Murphy is seen at its most remarkable in the Church of the Annunciation at Blackpool, where Murphy was commissioned by Dwyer to supervise the design inside and out of this memorial to William Dwyer's daughter Maeve Dwyer Clapham. The measure and impact of his personality and the origins of this fine church, to which the workers at Sunbeam were expected to make a significant contribution, and did, not only to their wage packets but in labour under foreman Mike Callaghan, have forged the legendary riposte by which the church is still known locally as Billy Dwyer's fire escape. The important thing about this really was that the church has the mark of a certain kind of genius on it, and it was everything in it, almost everything was done by Irish craftsmen, and it was all to Murphy's own designs. Then I come to Alois Fleischmann. It's hard now to explain the difference that the Fleischmann family, through certainly two and now three generations, have made, except through a litany of names from Arnold Bax to Sean O'Riordan, from Philip O'Leary to Tommaso Canning, from Daniel Corkery and Terence McSweeney, who wrote texts for the compositions by Alois Fleischmann Sr., and to the Cork Symphony Orchestra. There was from the founding of the Irish Music Teachers Association in 1935, of the Cork Symphony Orchestra in 1938, and the publication of a multimedia study based on Tilly Fleischmann's own classes in Germany with former pupils of Liszt. There are the compositions, at least 52 of them catalogued by Seamus de Barra, and many, if not most, composed on Irish themes or melodies. And there are the publications, foremost among them the monumental Sources of Irish Traditional Music circa from 1600 to 1855, edited by the late Micheál O'Sullivan. So the list goes on, ancient and modern, once upon a time meetings, concerts, campaigns, evocative of all the associated personalities, musicians, academics like Professor Stockley and his wife Germaine. She was the German novelist Annette Kolb, Darius Milhaud, John Taverner, William Walton, Sir John Barbarolli. You know, we forget that the streets that we walk and the buildings that we look at were actually walked and looked at by John Barbarolli, Ninette de Valois, Elizabeth Schumann, the Brodsky Quartet, and mixed in her Father Christy O'Flynn and Father Pat McSweeney, while the Fleischmann collaboration with Joan Denise Moriarty, who commissioned no fewer than 18 composers to write for her ballet company, introduced what Louis Marcus has described as a whiff of the Bolshoi on the Western Road. And I come to Gerald Goldberg and Sheila. Gerald died as president of the Cork Orchestral Society, which brought to the city Menuhin, Oistrakh, Ogden, Britten and Peers, Barbarolli, the orchestras of London, Boston and Vienna, and since then, through various associations, the whole roster of contemporary musicians. Without it, for years, there would have been little or no classical music in Cork at all. With Sheila, he founded the still active lunchtime concerts at the Crawford Gallery. With her, he supported the work of Joan Denise Moriarty, and it was Sheila, a fearsome fundraiser. People paid her quickly so that she wouldn't come again. It was Sheila who was chairman of the Abode Centre for Disabled Adults, having earlier worked for Meals on Wheels and the Cork Spastic Clinic. And it was Sheila who was a director of Cooperation North. With their mutual support system, brought Gerald into many of these activities. When Sheila died, her funeral cortege was awarded civic recognition from the steps of City Hall. For Gerald's career in local government, culminating in his election as Lord Mayor in 1977, depended on the grateful purposefulness she provided. I have to add, I had great admiration for Gerald Goldberg, but his mayoral speeches were exceptionally long. And that's where I felt Sheila let us all down. There's so much left behind to reveal his works, but not his immense, hungry and austere, assertive personality. At its core was the boy whose mother told him to take off his shoes before he went out to play with the children in the street so that he would be barefoot like them. Finally, the person that I thought was possibly least immediately typical, but also most representative of the cultural life of the city, for Seamus and Mairead, and for people even like myself. I remember being up at Skiddy's home with J.B. Carney conducting the way we were to lie down in front of the earth movers to stop the destruction of Skiddy's home, which was to be demolished by the North Infirmary. I just remember his mild voice reaching over all our anxious heads. He was the obstetrician and gynecologist and the leader of what is known in Cork as highly respected medical families, the Carneys. He was very involved in many art projects, including the famous Cork Rosk exhibition in 1980, and he was also privately known to have actually supported and subsidised important artists and musicians. When he died, I was writing about his house, Chipley, on the Blackrock Road, and met the antiquarian Leslie Roberts there, and he has listed JB's memberships, which I thought, just to round this off, give some idea of the kind of things that could go on and were go on among the people who made up the circle that Seamus and Mairead dominated in their own way. So, there, for JB, there was, and I'm leaving out all medical references because you can imagine there must have been a few associations there as well. There was the arts, he was in the Arts Council. the Belfast Naturalists Field Club, Contemporary Irish Art Society, Cork Historical and Archaeological Society, Cork International Choral Festival, Cork Literary and Scientific Society, Cork Orchestral Society, Cork Ornithological Society, Cork Preservation Society, of which he was, of course, a founder member, therefore Skiddy's home. Cork was not the world, so there were also Friends of the National Collections of Ireland, the Association of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Irish Georgian Society, Kilkenny Archaeological Society, Military History Society of Ireland, Roscrea Heritage Society, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, and the Wexford Festival Opera. That's not all by any means, but it's enough to be going on with. And now, here's the real thing, Orla Murphy.
Hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'd also like to thank Mary Leland for her fantastic introduction, in which I learned an awful lot that I never knew about Cork. I'd also like to thank Simon and Victoria, Billy O'Flaherty, the sound men at the back, and the sound woman by my side, who is my daughter Leithen, who has been an enormous help in this. So now I shall lash into it. Sculpture is made to be seen in the round, its three dimensions to be viewed from all sides as the viewer walks around the work. I'm hearing noise. Yeah. Sorry, I hear a kind of feedback. Am I too close to it or too? Okay. Meant to be seen, its three dimensions to be viewed from all sides as the viewer walks around the work. There is, of course, another dimension, the connection between the viewer and the work, and it is this dimension that I am attempting to bring to you today. I cannot offer a complete view of Seamus and his work. I am not an art historian or indeed an expert of any sort, so I'm going to show you glimpses from various angles with the intention of encouraging you to return to the works themselves, or if you've not seen them, to find them for yourselves, as many of them are on public view. Now there's a catalogue brought out in 1982 by my sister Bevine and a team of people. And this has all his works in it, as far as we knew them at the time, and also their situations. So it's a great sort of pocket edition there for you to go and find the things for yourselves, because there are far too many works for me to mention. It gives the location of the sculptures, and it also has essays by, among others, the filmmaker Louis Marcus, the sculptor Oisin Kelly, and others. There's also a large catalogue that was made in, could you hold it up there? Made for Seamus' centenary by the generosity of the city fathers and many people. And that has many wonderful photographs in it. And it also has essays by, among others, Seamus himself on the art of the craft of lettering, about which he was passionate. It's available in all good libraries, I'm sure, and also in the Crawford. But the smaller catalogue, the earlier one, is available here today for a tenner. Okay. The philosopher Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," in French first and Latin second. And if Seamus had had a motto, it might have been, borrowing from the folklorist Henry Glassy, "I make, therefore I am." Seamus was born in 1907 in Mallow, North Cork, to James Murphy and his wife Margaret. Margaret Sheehan was from Little Island in Cork Harbour, and this is the only picture that we have of her. It was taken in the backyard of the house where Seamus and his brothers were reared, 149 Sun Row, Dillon's Cross, on the north side of the city, an area that is still on the edge of the country. Have we got the house? Yeah. And then the plaque. And the plaque that you can see was made by the sculptor Ken Thompson. And now we go on to Seamus and his father. Here we see Seamus in his studio with a bronze portrait head of his father, which he made in 1957. Seamus was one of twin boys, and when they were a few months old, the family moved to Cork, where his father was employed as a train driver. There were altogether 8 children born to James and Margaret Murphy. Timothy, who died in an accident at about the age of 8 or 9, the twins, Seamus and John, who also worked in the railway, Michael, who was an accountant, and the youngest, Bartholomew, known to us as Uncle Bat, himself a skilled craftsman in wood. There were 3 sisters who died in infancy of diphtheria. Their mother, Margaret, died in her 50s in 1937 and was survived for many, many years by her husband, who continued to live at Dillon's Cross with the boys until the last few years of his life, when he moved to live with Bat and family at nearby Harrington Square, Old Yall Road. We have little information about James Murphy's forebears, but it is said that he descended from a family who were evicted from their farm at Burnfort near Mallow during the famine. Seamus and his brothers attended St. Patrick's National School, which was then at St. Luke's Cross, a building which has since been demolished. While there, Seamus learned drawing from Daniel Corkery. Now, Mary has mentioned Daniel Corkery, who was a writer, produced two classic works. He was also interested in all of the arts, particularly theatre, and he became Professor of English in University College Cork, and he was himself a fine watercolourist. And I suppose Seamus's biggest influence in one sense. After National School, Seamus was apprenticed to O'Connell's art marble works on the Watercourse Road, Blackpool. His father could not afford the fee for the apprenticeship, so Seamus gave a year's work to O'Connell's when he had finished his training. A full account of that time is given in his book Stone Mad. Stone Mad has gone through 4 publishers. The first was in Dublin, the second in London, the third in Belfast, and the most recent one was the Collins Press in Cork. But now Collins has gone out of business and the book is out of print, so we're looking for a publisher. During the time of his apprenticeship, Seamus also attended Crawford School of Art as a 9th student at Daniel Corkery's suggestion. My sister Bevine tells me that Corkery paid the fees. Mary Leland has mentioned many of the people who in one way or another were influential in Seamus's life, but the principal support during his lifetime was his wife, Mairead, whom she did mention, yes. Seamus married Mairead in 1944. She was the daughter of a sculptor, Joseph Higgins, and was herself an art teacher. Now, I should say about Joseph Higgins that despite everything, he continues to be little known, but Seamus said that he was a better sculptor than himself. And Joseph Higgins' work can be seen in Fitzgerald Park, in the little side of the pond, Boyle with a boat, and there are 2 fine bronze portrait heads in UCC and 2 wonderful ones of yawl fishermen in the Crawford. And during Peter Murray's time, those 2 heads in the Crawford were always on view. Joseph Higgins was a marvellous sculptor. So Mairead was an art teacher. Seamus suffered from ill health, so the burden of earning a living fell on her during his times in hospital and also when he had no commissions. In 1932, Seamus won the Gibson Bequest Scholarship and spent a year in Paris, where he studied at the Académie Colarossi and other art schools. In the 2007 catalogue, the big book, the art historian Anne Wilson has a very detailed and interesting account of Seamus's time in Paris. Here we come with... Now here, we have 2 interesting photographs here, because the first shows Ruth Ripley, one of an American group of friends who Seamus knew in Paris at that time. And this was taken in Paris, where Seamus was making in clay a portrait of Ruth Ripley. And then we go on to the next one. So after that, he made a plaster cast from the clay, and then he brought the plaster cast back to Cork. And so then we have Ruth Ripley, 1934, after Seamus came back. which is on display in the Crawford Gallery, I think, at the moment. It certainly belongs to the Crawford Gallery and maybe in the large gallery upstairs, first room on the right. I think it may be on display there. The Crawford also holds approximately 125 or more of Seamus's portrait heads donated by the family in 2007, the year of his centenary. These are plaster casts. Now, Crawford also has some bronzes, but the donations were the plaster cast collection. And whereas they belong to the Crawford Gallery, arrangements may be had to have bronze casts taken if anybody should wish. End of that commercial. When Seamus returned from Paris, he set up his own studio on the Watercourse Road. Have we got that? Yeah. It adjoins O'Connell's Yard, where he had trained, and O'Connell's and he had a very practical and happy partnership for all of his working life. This drawing is by William Harrington, and this is from Stone Mad, where William made all the drawings, the illustrations. Seamus built the studio himself for work that could be made indoors, and opposite the indoor studio was the shed. That's what we always call the shed. Was made of corrugated iron, open to the weather and, of course, to the light. This is where the larger stoneworks, statues and gravestones were made. You may see Seamus at work in his studio in Louis Marquez's film The Silent Art, which is free to view on the IFI website. It was made in 1959. The drawing, I said that, is by William Harrington, and so on, so on, so on. Right. And now to the photographs of the works, which I've put in groups rather than in chronological order, beginning with the large carvings in stone. So this first one is the Madonna of the Twilight, sometimes referred to as the Virgin of the Twilight, but at home she was always called the Madonna of the Twilight. Made in 1941-42, she is 6'6" tall, made in Kilkenny limestone. And that is the unpolished statue in his studio. And then we have the polished statue. Now, Kilkenny limestone is a sort of pale grey when unpolished, and then when polished, it comes out this wonderful black, strong black, which emphasises, I think, the sharpness of the carving. This statue remained in Seamus's studio for almost 20 years, until it was bought by public subscription. And here I mention the Cork Sculpture Park Committee, of which, of course, Dr. J.B. Carney was a member. It was set up in the early 1960s, 61, 62, and Bevin was the secretary to that organisation, in which many of the people that Mary has mentioned were probably involved. The Cork Sculpture Park Committee was to bring out into the open, say, from galleries, or not have them within galleries, but into spaces where the public goes to enjoy and look around. And so the Sculpture Park in Cork, for those of you who don't know, is situated in Fitzgerald Park, between the river and the Western Road, signposted. So the version of the Madonna of the Twilight, I should say, was the first statue purchased for the Sculpture Park. Now, anything more to say about that? Yes, in the catalogue that Bevin produced, Oisin Kelly has a very interesting and very feisty essay. And he, of course, as you know, was himself a very important sculptor, and he was a contemporary of Seamus's, and so this is a very nice piece of support from him. Oisin Kelly refers to the Madonna of the Twilight as the most important carving made in Ireland in the 20th century. Now, the next one I come to is Dreamline. This Dreamline is made from Portland stone. Portland stone being a bit more porous, it doesn't weather as well as limestone. It is in Fitzgerald Park as part of the Sculpture Park set of sculptures. Now, can we have the next one? This is Dreamline and Leathan. Taken in 2007, when the work had been cleaned for Seamus's centenary. And I put it in because this is a history festival, and needless to say, dealing with the past, but I wanted to try to show that, in fact, the sculpture continues to be of the present, and I hope with your continued interest, something that people will go and look at and admire and enjoy in the future. Both Dreamline and the Madonna of the Twilight, the plan is to bring them both indoors because they're both suffering from, weathering, let us say. In fact, you could show the photograph, and you see there now, just after 2007, already she began to weather. And eventually that becomes very disfiguring. So this is the Portland stone, obviously. And so Dreamline, which this is, which was made in 1934, just after he came back from Paris, that and the Madonna of the Twilight are going to be brought indoors at the museum in Fitzgerald Park. Now, a nice addition to that will be Seamus's tools. Now, our mother gave Seamus's tools to the sculptor Ken Thompson in 2007, or before it. Anyway, after Seamus died in 1975, and his tools were given to Ken Thompson. And then in 2007, Ken donated these to the museum. So the plan is to have the two very large sculptures and the tools and another item that I will come to in a minute as a sort of a little display of some of what I think Seamus himself would have regarded as his most important work and the implements with which he made them. That's that. Okay. We're on to, and now we move outside of Cork to, I should say that Seamus's work is not only in Cork City, but around the county and around the country, and I will mention other things. But first of all, we go to Boyle, Cooley, where the statue of Neamh Gobnat, the local saint, was made for 1950, and this is limestone. And we go on, this is Seamus making the statue, and then we go on, here she is in Cooley, and as you see, she's on a very interesting base, which he made, as it's all part of one. And here we have the detail of the bees and the hive's entrance. And Seamus was very, very keen on the research and the background and the lore associated with the work. And I think there are several stories going with Neamh Gobnat, but there is one in which, as she was a beekeeper, and one day she saw a deer coming down, tearing down the hills near Cooley, near her own place, and being pursued by hounds. So Neamh Gobnat sent out the bees to drive off the hounds and save the deer. And Seamus loved this story, and so he put an element of the hive at the base, and you can see the doorway where the bees go in and out. And then the bees along the front, I certainly recall him saying, and he researched this very much, anybody who's a beekeeper will know the book, The Lore of the Honey Bee by Tickner Edwards. And Seamus finally chose the worker bee, which I think is so appropriate for him. He never stopped working. And then we move on to, is that right? Is that next? Okay. Yes, of course, sorry. This is St. Joseph, and St. Joseph is in Benburb, County Tyrone. And I put it in partly because I think the stance is lovely. It's sort of strong, and 1 foot out to one side. And of course, there is the detail of the saw. And Seamus had this enormous interest and respect in the tools of the trade. So there's the saw and St. Joseph. And who was a carpenter, in case anybody needed to be told that. Now, in 1952, and here's a statue which is not one of the large ones. The others are either life-sized or larger. This is the mother and child. It's only 3 feet in height. It is to be seen at the Church of the Descent of the Holy Ghost at Wilton. That's a very large church as you're coming down the Wilton Road. Hard to see from the road, but if you have a chance to walk up, this is situated between the 2 doors. There is a story behind this, and it's not one of the better ones. This is 1952, and in the 50s, the Bishop of Cork commissioned the building of 5 churches in none of which did he give Seamus any work. So the usual suspects mentioned by Mary all got together and they raised the funds for the purchase of this little statue, which was then put on one of the 5 churches, I have to say. And Seamus at that stage considered emigrating. And as an aside, he could actually have got a job on York Cathedral, but he decided to stay. I think myself that the time when he would have been really in his element was in medieval France, the building of the great cathedrals. He believed that architecture and sculpture went absolutely together, and I think he would have been really happy at Chartres myself. This is the Madonna of the Globe. She is 8'6" in height, and she is at Sunday's Well in Cork on St. Vincent's Church. Nothing more to say except that Seamus always had a cat around the studio and saucers of milk. Okay, now we come to Seamus's largest commission, which is St. Bridget. Should we go move on to St. Bridget? What was it? Right, St. Bridget. She is 8'6". St. Bridget and the 12 Apostles. Now, this was made, St. Bridget, in 1947-48. And she was commissioned by a priest in America, where she now stands on the Church of St. Bridget in San Francisco. And behind her are the 12 Apostles. These are life-size. They're about 6 foot tall, each of them. And they were designed specially to fit in the 12 niches across the facade of the church. It is said that some of these faces are recognizable, and we know that one of them, we don't have a close-up, but one of them is based on the face of De Valera, and it is Doubting Thomas. Yes. Yeah, and you will recognise it if you get to look at a good photograph. Yeah, and if you have any relations in San Francisco, please ask them to go and look, because the church was decommissioned many years ago, and we'd like to know what's happening. There's also in America, though we don't have a photograph of it at the moment, a statue of St. Patrick in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now we come on to a much more local one, and this is in Bantry. 2 statues at Bantry Church, Roman Catholic Church. There's St. Finbar and St. Ita. Now, in the large catalogue, the art historian Anne Wilson, whom I mentioned already for her essay on Seamus in Paris, she has very interesting comments about these statues, which she considers to show the influence of modernism on his work, which, of course, is what was happening while he was in Paris. And they're wonderfully situated. They're at first floor level, and because the church is in such a lovely rise, as you climb up the hill towards the door, you can see them clearly, St. Finbar and St. Ita. Made in 1934, straight after Paris, and anything more to say about them? They are also in limestone. Okay, now we move on to, thank you for that. We move on to Michael Collins. Now, this is not a statue. It is a portrait bust, but it is one of the very large works, so I thought I'd include it with these. This is Michael Collins in marble, made in 1948. Any size that is larger than life size, I think, is called heroic, and this is definitely heroic size. It's about that wide and about that high, and you can see it, the marble, in the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin, where if you go in the door and you look over your left shoulder, it's perched on a windowsill. Now, there is also the same size, the plaster cast, exactly the same thing. The plaster cast is in the Michael Collins Museum in Clonakilty. It has been painted dark brown, but it is not bronze, it is plaster. But that's the nearest one, okay. Now, this was exhibited. Seamus had a solo exhibition, his only solo exhibition in his lifetime, in 1956 in the in the public library in Cork on the Grand Parade there. And this was one of the statues that was one of the works that was exhibited in that. And the exhibition was attended by the president at that time, Sean T. O'Callaghan, and he then initiated a subscription to buy the work for the people of Ireland. And of course supported as usual by people that Mary has mentioned and lots of other people. This was not just wonderful for Seamus to get this kind of affirmation after very hard times, but it also, I don't know if this was much mentioned at the time, but Sean T. O'Callaghan was actually on the other side during the Civil War. He was a De Valera man. And so this gesture, this symbolic gesture, was very important, very graceful, I think. Now, there's a bronze of the same work. I should say, I forgot to tell you that Seamus made this not through any particular political thing, but because he had a very large piece of Carrara marble, which, on its way from Italy, the commission was cancelled. So he was left with a huge piece of marble, and what was he going to do? So he chose Collins because he was so handsome, I think, such a wonderful head. And so it evolved, like there was the plaster cast, and then there was the marble. And then finally, in 1986, Con Murphy, another one of the terrific Cork businessmen, who was the founder and proprietor of Douglas Woolen Mills and gave much employment in the city, Con Murphy commissioned the making of the bronze, which is I suppose it's about the same size. Anyways, it's absolutely enormous, and it is in the Sculpture Park in Fitzgerald Park. And if you go in the main gate and you look sort of diagonally across to your left, yes, the museum is there, and you look across to your left, Collins Head is situated surrounded by trees, and it's a very good situation. It's really difficult to get it right with sculpture, I think, and so very much indebted to Con Murphy, a great man. Now we get on to Blackpool Church. Now, Blackpool Church, this is a drawing made by Seamus, and it's of Blackpool Church, which was commissioned, the church was commissioned or brought into, dedicated, I should say, in 1945. And the architects were O'Flynn's, and this drawing is by Seamus. And as Mary said, William Dwyer was the person who paid for this church. It's a wonderful thing for anybody to be able to see Seamus's work indoors. The statues, which are in Portland stone, have not weathered, so they're practically in their original pristine condition. And of course, you yourself will be out of the weather, which is very pertinent. Now, Seamus did a lot of work on the inside of this. Here we have the church interior. Oh, beg your pardon, the church exterior. The thing about this church, it's unusual in churches in Cork in that there's a very fine lead into it. I think there's an architect down there at the back, and I hope he agrees with me, that Great William O'Brien Street, which this church is on, it's in Blackpool, and it's one of the wider streets in Blackpool, which specialises in very narrow streets. And the church is at the far end, so you get a wonderful approach to the church along William O'Brien Street, Great William O'Brien Street, which Mary already mentioned because the Cork City and County Archive, which was dedicated in memory of Seamus in 2007, that's on Great William O'Brien Street. And also, I should mention somebody of whom Seamus made a portrait head, Thomas McCurtain, the Lord Mayor. His shop was on Great William O'Brien Street, and he was actually taken out and shot, I believe, there by forces unnamed. So that's, now this is the tympanum, which is above the main door of the church. It's the Church of the Annunciation, and here we can see it, and it's in lovely condition, I think. And next we have one of the statues inside, which is the Sacred Heart, kind of obvious. It's in Portland stone, as I said, and it's well over 6 foot tall, I suppose, but it's up on a pedestal, so quite impressive on one side of the altar, and the statue of Our Lady, I think, is on the other side of the main altar. But then we come to the children's altar. Now, I hope you can see, oh yeah, you can see all of that. Yeah. the children's altar, which has it has the angel drawing that he made on the left. And then on the altar itself, the carved angel is in there somewhere. And all of this by Seamus. And unusual, there's gilding in the background, which I think really enhances it. And again, it's in lovely condition. So that's Blackpool Church. Now we come to the plaques. Now Seamus, as I said, was absolutely passionate about lettering. I hope there are a few stone carvers here and they'll know that lettering is it's quite a challenge, and it's also a means of expressing yourself in subtle ways, I think. This is Shandon Tower. It's in polished slate. It was made in 1956 and exhibited in that solo exhibition in the library. Now, it was commissioned by Gerald Goldberg, and he had it, I think, in his garden for all of his life. And then when he died, his son Theo inherited it. So I'm sorry to say you can't actually see it unless you visit Theo in England. Theo and Val, and I'm sure that would be very nice. But I thought it's an absolutely beautiful work. And how big is it? I suppose it's about that size by that. I mean, it's quite substantial. And you see Shandon and James loved carving this. It's just a wonderful piece. And beautiful lettering, as you can see. And the inscription, it isn't actually... It's 2 pages in the large book, so you can see the curve of the page. Well, you can't see the curve of the page because it's over the top. You can see the curve of the page there, but in fact, it's just one item. It's not a double. The inscription was composed specially by the writer Sean O'Foylan, who was a terrific friend of Seamus's. And indeed, Sean O'Foylan's head, bronze head, is in the library as well. So that's, oh yes, now we come to the next, which is the Seasons. These are in Portland stone. We're only showing 2 of them. They're about 3 foot high and about 2 foot 3 inches in width. And these are also displayed in the Sculpture Park in Fitzgerald Park. And they are also to be brought indoors because they're really quite small, and so it's difficult to read them. They're on a background that is quite busy, and I don't think anybody ever sees them. They were made in 1940, and they incorporate some of the things Seamus most loved. He was a very keen on nature, as you remember perhaps that he was brought up in that little house on the cusp of city and county, and he spent long times walking the country roads, identifying the birds which he could identify by their song, and picking wildflowers and identifying wildflowers. And I think Baveen will agree that some of our happiest memories were up in that part of Cork, in the Glen and beyond, with Seamus. And you can see, I mean, the richness there on the left. We have spring, with the child being held up to the sun, the new infant, and the daffodils and lambs. And on the right then we have summer, where you have the full standing corn and the leaping fish. Seamus had a great thing about fish because of the shape, and he admired very much the original coinage, which was designed, I think, after, it was in the 1920s, by the Englishman Percy Metcalfe. And Seamus loved these coins and their beautiful depiction of animals for anybody who's old enough to remember them, but particularly the coin, the 2-shilling coin, which is the florin, which had the salmon and the curve of the salmon fitting so beautifully onto the coin. As you can see, you remember it, yes. Yeah, the 2-shilling coin. I think that's about all I was saying. Right, are we tight on time now? Right, okay. The Four Evangelists, I absolutely love this one. It's very visible. It's on the facade of Carrigaline Church. Very easy to see at a good height. And now I'm just showing 2 of them because there is a little story going with these 2. We have St. Luke. This is St. Luke, is it? Yeah. Have I got St. Luke? All right, so this is the ox or bull. And as you can see, sitting on the book is a fly. And so this is taken from Aesop's Fables, where the fly lands on the wheel of the oxes, was carrying this terrible load uphill, and the fly says to the ox, "Aren't we marvellous? Look at what we can pull uphill." So that was from Aesop. And Seamus loved the background, as I said, and Aesop's fable, so that worked its way into that. And then we have the next one, which is St. John, Nave Owen, the eagle and the wren. So this was taken from the old Irish saga, which everybody knows about the king of the birds, and which was the king, the one who could fly highest, and the eagle flew up and was about to be declared the king, and then the wren, which was on the eagle's back, flew up a few inches. So the wren is the king of the birds. And the reason all these things, and there are other details that have crept in, things like butterflies and all kinds of things have crept in to these two of the four evangelists, is because the parish priest didn't come up with the money. So the Plaques stayed in the studio longer than they should have, so Seamus got to put in things that he liked for his own amusement. Yeah. And maybe also showing something of his humour, he chose details from the pre-Christian era. Okay, so now we're on to the School of Music, Union Quay. There are 6 plaques, 4 of which are still outside, mounted on the wonderful new building, and they're very much more visible and much easier to see now. And there are 2 inside, and there are also 2, anybody who wants to see these should also go in and see the 2 plaques that are on Connemara marble, and I think the lettering is gilded, and really lovely. And when I asked Seamus, why didn't you do more on Connemara marble, he said because it's so difficult to get big enough pieces of Connemara marble. And the last plaque that we have a photograph of is one of Dunlop, another factory in Cork. Lots of employment there. It's in Portland stone. When the factory closed down, it somehow found its way to UCC, University College Cork, where eventually it was made in 1959, but in the late 80s, I suppose, or no, in the 90s, Kieran Murphy, Seamus's youngest nephew, who was a professor in UCC, he retrieved the Dunlop plaque, and he had it cleaned and mounted and lit and put in a glass case, and it's really very visible in what I think is the lobby of the New Arts building. And there's also an inscription of Seamus's on a plaque in the same area, Dunlop to Portland stone, and a wonderful job that Kieran very generously did for his uncle. And sorry, not ready yet. I should mention one that we don't have a photograph of, but it's the one at Drishaan House at Castle Townsend. As you approach the gate, as you're on your way in to see the wonderful gardens, there is a seat on your right, a stone seat, and above it a plaque dedicated to Vice Admiral Boyle Somerville. It's inscribed Corsa Ma, a good neighbour. And it was, I don't have the date, 1937, I think it was. Sorry? 36. And there is a lovely poem by Paul Durkin which commemorates that. I think it's called The Night They Murdered Boyle Somerville. I think it's, anyway, it's a very short poem, wonderful. And they all go together. I'm sorry we haven't got a photograph, but it's very handy for you to go and look at and sit on the seat and think about Seamus, but also about Boyle Somerville. We're on a rundown.
Yeah, we probably should skip a few things, I think, maybe.
Are we overrunning too much?
Yeah, we're 5 past 5.
5 minutes, okay. Should we run through the headstones?
I'll just do a quick.
Okay, Sean O'Reilly's headstone. It's in Cooley, and the second inscription was by Ken Thompson, and this is a wonderful example of how to compare 2 styles, because they do differ. They're in sympathy, but they differ. And then we have, who do we have next? We have Tomás Ó Cruthain, wonderful, again, well, she says a salmon, I think it's actually a mackerel. And on the back there's a Nea Vogue with chaps rowing, and that's in, Tomás Ó Cruthain would be in Dunqueen in the old graveyard, I think. And also, this is Seamus with the tombstone for Peg Sayers. And those 2 stones look out over the sea towards the Blasket Islands, from which those 2 wonderful writers came. And Seamus loved their work, particularly Tomás Ó Cruthain. And the last one is one that I put in because, again, it shows his love of the tools of the trade. And this is for P.J. Hegarty, who was buried in St. Finbar Cemetery in Cork, where Seamus has no fewer than 70 tombstones. So silver catalogue, very useful, finding those for yourself. And the detail of the tools of the trade. And I just want to mention that the last inscription on the front of the stone was made by Cork stone carver Terry McCarthy, one of a great family of stone masons and stone carvers, Terry McCarthy, who died 2 weeks ago. So just like to mention him. Seamus had a great time for him, and he learnt something from Seamus. And now we have the portrait heads, and I'll rush through the portrait heads. This is Uncle Bat. It was made in 1973, and a wonderful head showing him at his best when he was, in his youth, he was a very keen oarsman. And then we come to Sylphide, made in 1942, and Mairead, our mother, was the model for this white marble, which I think belongs to Kieran Murphy, so you'd have to ask Kieran if you can see it. The next one is Daydream, made in 1931. It's in the Crawford Gallery, and it shows that Seamus had fully developed his skills in stone carving before he went to Paris, okay, where he mainly did life drawing and figure modelling. Yep. And then we have Frank O'Connor, very dear friend of Seamus's, and that also is in Cork Public Library, very visible on the right-hand side of the main reading room. It was made in 1957, and you can't really see, but you should look at the beautiful neck piece that he's wearing, which is silver on the outside and turquoise on the inside, not on the bronze, but the original thing which we remember O'Connor wearing. Wonderful man, wonderful writer, and lovely head. And this, sorry about this now. This is the tailor Taigo Boyle, made in 1936. Most of you will be familiar with the book The Tailor and Anstey, and in it the chapter which tells of the making of this head. So the author sat in a corner taking notes. Seamus made the head, and Taigo Boyle, the great tailor, spoke brilliantly both in Irish and English, and his wife bustled about making smarky remarks. And this is the head of the author, as Eric Cross. Yep. And so now we come back to the studio, to William Harrington's drawing of the studio, and Seamus said that William Harrington was the finest draftsman in Ireland at that time, and that's why Seamus insisted that he be used for the 1966 edition of the book, and subsequent editions have all got William's wonderful drawings. Okay, you will see on the left the horse trough. Now, the horse trough, I think, is made in cast concrete, and Seamus didn't make it and didn't design it, and there are several of them around Cork. I hope they're still there. But the farmers coming in from the countryside, this is Blackpool, countryside is very near, farmers bringing produce into the market and to the Cold Quay would stop there so that the horse could have a drink, and Seamus would wander out and have a chat. And there is one particular farmer, and he's in red sandstone, and if you want to see him, you'll have to ask them in the Royal Hibernian Academy, which acquired the work some years ago, the farmer in red sandstone. And I've run over time. Thank you very much. I will go faster and faster. Thank you.